The scene was like something out of a nightmare. My pristine Hermès Kelly bag, the one I had saved for 2 years to buy, now dripped with electric blue paint that pulled on the pristine concrete of the community pavilion. Gasps echoed through the crowd of shocked neighbors as they witnessed what had just happened. At the center of it all stood Karen Mitchell, the HOA president, her face twisted with self-righteous fury and not an ounce of remorse in her eyes. She held the empty paint can like a weapon of justice, completely oblivious to the fact that police sirens were already wailing in the distance, rushing toward our upscale Maple Grove neighborhood to arrest her for destruction of property. But let me back up and tell you how we got to this moment of absolute insanity. 3 weeks earlier, I had just moved into what I thought would be my dream neighborhood. Maple Grove Estates was everything I had worked toward as a marketing executive at a tech company. The houses were gorgeous, the landscaping was immaculate, and the community amenities were top-notch. I was excited to attend my first HOA-sponsored barbecue, thinking it would be a great way to meet my new neighbors and settle into suburban life. I remember choosing my outfit carefully that Saturday morning. I wanted to make a good first impression, so I wore a simple sundress and carried my most prized possession, the Hermès Kelly bag I had purchased after getting my promotion. It was classic black leather, elegant without being flashy, and it represented all the hard work I had put into building my career. As I walked into the community pavilion, I felt confident and ready to become part of this new community. That confidence lasted exactly 5 minutes. Karen Mitchell spotted me the moment I walked through the entrance. She was a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She introduced herself as the HOA president with the air of someone who took that title very seriously. Her gaze immediately locked onto my handbag, and I watched as her expression shifted from polite interest to barely concealed disdain. The passive aggressive comments started almost immediately. Karen made her way over to me with a plate of potato salad and what she probably thought was subtle criticism. She mentioned how nice it must be to have so much disposable income that I could spend it on unnecessary luxuries. She wondered aloud whether people in the neighborhood might feel uncomfortable around such obvious displays of wealth. Each comment was delivered with a saccharine smile, but the venom underneath was impossible to miss. I tried to deflect with humor, explaining that I had worked hard and saved for the bag, but Karen was not interested in hearing about my career or my financial responsibility. In her mind, I had already been categorized as someone who flaunted money inappropriately. She spent the rest of the barbecue making pointed comments about materialism and excess. Whenever she passed by my conversation group, other neighbors began to notice the tension, and I could see them glancing between us with uncomfortable expressions. The real harassment began the following week. I came home from work on Tuesday to find a citation from the HOA tucked under my windshield wiper. Apparently, my garbage can had been left out 15 minutes past the designated pickup time on Thursday. Another citation appeared, this time claiming my lawn needed edging despite the fact that the landscaping service had been there just 2 days before. Friday brought a formal letter about my mailbox being a 4-in-2, far from the prescribed distance from the curb. Each infraction was technically within Karen's authority as HOA president, but the pattern was obvious. She was using her position to target me, specifically finding microscopic violations that she ignored in other yards. I documented everything carefully, taking photos and keeping detailed records because I had a feeling this was going to escalate beyond petty harassment. My instincts proved correct. At the next community event 3 weeks later, it was the annual Fall Festival, held in the same pavilion where I had first met Karen, I made the mistake of carrying the same Hermes bag not because I wanted to provoke anyone, but simply because it was my everyday purse. The moment Karen saw me walk in, her face flushed with anger. She had clearly been stewing over what she perceived as my defiance of her authority. The confrontation started with Karen loudly announcing to anyone within earshot that some people in the neighborhood seemed to think they were better than everyone else. She pointed directly at me and declared that my attitude was exactly what was wrong with society today. People were starting to stare as her voice grew louder and more aggressive. She accused me of rubbing my wealth in everyone's faces and demanded to know why I thought I was special. I tried to remain calm and professional, explaining that I was simply carrying a handbag and had no intention of making anyone uncomfortable. But Karen was beyond reason at this point. She had worked herself into a self-righteous frenzy, convinced that she was standing up for the moral values of the community. She began lecturing me about the starving children who could have been fed with the money I spent on designer accessories. The situation reached its breaking point when Karen disappeared for a few minutes and returned carrying a can of electric blue paint from the craft station where children had been making decorations. The crowd around us grew silent as they sensed something was about to happen. Karen held the paint can above her head like she was making some kind of revolutionary statement. She screamed that wasteful extravagance had no place in a respectable neighborhood like ours. Before anyone could react, she dumped the entire contents of the paint can directly onto my handbag. The thick electric blue paint splattered across the beautiful black leather and pulled on the ground around my feet. The entire pavilion fell silent except for the sound of paint dripping onto concrete. I stood there for a moment processing what had just happened. My beautiful handbag was completely destroyed, covered in paint that was already starting to dry and set into the leather. But instead of breaking down or screaming back at Karen, I felt an unusual sense of calm wash over me. This was exactly the kind of dramatic overreaction I had been expecting from her, and I was prepared. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 while maintaining eye contact with Karen. The entire time I spoke clearly and calmly to the dispatcher, explaining that I needed police assistance for destruction of property at the Maple Grove Community Center. Karen stood there with the empty paint can still in her hands, apparently shocked that I was actually calling the authorities. She seemed to have expected me to either cry or get into a screaming match with her. The other neighbors began pulling out their phones as well, some calling their spouses to tell them what they had just witnessed, others taking photos and videos of the scene. Karen tried to justify her actions to anyone who would listen, insisting that she had done the right thing by taking a stand against materialism. But the crowd was not sympathetic to her cause. They could see that she had crossed a line from petty harassment into criminal behavior. Within 10 minutes, two police officers arrived at the pavilion. They surveyed the scene, taking note of the paint-covered handbag and the empty can still clutched in Karen's hands. I provided them with a calm, factual account of what had happened while Karen launched into a rambling explanation about moral responsibility and community values. The officers listened patiently to both sides before informing Karen that she was being arrested for destruction of property. The moment the handcuffs clicked around Karen's wrists, her self-righteous confidence finally cracked. She began protesting loudly that this was all a misunderstanding, that she was just trying to teach me a lesson about being considerate of others. But the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses had seen her deliberately pour paint on my personal property, and several people had captured the entire incident on their phones. As the police led Karen away, she turned back to shout at me one more time. She insisted that I would regret making such a big deal out of a simple handbag, that the community would see through my victim act but her. Words fell flat as neighbors shook their heads in disgust at her behavior. The woman who had positioned herself as the moral authority of our neighborhood was now being arrested in front of everyone. She had tried to impress the aftermath, moved quickly once the legal system got involved. The handbag was appraised at $4,000 to $100, making Karen's crime a felony charge of destruction of property over $1,000. She was also hit with a civil lawsuit for the full replacement value, plus emotional distress damages. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her from her position as president, citing conduct unbecoming of a community leader. Karen's attempts to defend herself only made things worse. She hired an expensive lawyer and tried to argue that her actions were justified as a form of community activism. The judge was not impressed with this defense, especially when the prosecution presented evidence of Karen's pattern of harassment through frivolous HOA citations. The video footage from the fall festival made it impossible for her to deny what she had done. In the end, Karen was sentenced to 6 months in county jail, suspended pending 2 years of probation, and ordered to pay $7,000 in restitution and court costs. Her shocked expression when the judge read the sentence was almost as satisfying as watching her get arrested in the first